Hello, and thank you very much for coming in along this evening. We're going to, in fact, look this evening at a series of issues, which will probably take us more than one evening to do, but we can look at them in a series of different weeks as well. The issue at stake is an old one and a new one. It's an old one in the sense that it's been here for quite a while, and we've seen it recur and recur and recur. In fact, we're going to start off by thinking about an early interview about 30 years ago that was given about the nature of the lies and deceit that run government, basically are needed for the running of the American government at this point. We were reminded of this by a very famous academic scholar, but observer of the political scene as well, who at one point said we are entangled in webs of endless deceit, which is the quote at the beginning here. And we're going to look at part one, the big stick and the big lie. This was something that was actually brought up in an interview by Bill Moyers back in 1988 and part of a program called A World of Ideas. And we can capture it once again, taking a look at the sense that was meant at the time.
Good evening, I'm Bill Moyers. What's more dangerous, the big stick or the big lie? Governments have used both against their own people. Tonight I'll be talking with a man who has been thinking about how we can see the developing lie. He says that propaganda is to democracy what violence is to a dictatorship, but he hasn't lost faith in the power of common people to speak up for the truth. You have said that we live entangled in webs of endless deceit, that we live in a highly indoctrinated society where elementary truths are easily buried. Elementary truths such as
the fact that we invaded South Vietnam, or the fact that we're standing in the way of significant, and have for years, of significant moves towards arms negotiation, or the fact that the military system is to a substantial extent, not totally, but to a substantial extent, a mechanism by which the general population is compelled to provide a subsidy to high technology industry. Since they're not going to do it if you ask them to, you have to deceive them into doing it. I think there are many truths like that, and we don't face them.
Many truths like that, and we don't face them. This is really quite an extraordinary statement. Back in 1988, that's 30 years ago, right? 30 years ago is actually a very significant time, in part because it's 20 years after 1968, and that's 50 years ago. Okay? 68 was a period of very strong foment on the university campuses, and Professor Chomsky was part of that foment. He was an observer of it, but also a participant in a lot of it. And it's very interesting to see his observations 20 years after that. As you can tell, Moyers questioned Chomsky about this issue. Take a look.
You have said that we live entangled in webs of endless deceit, that we live in a highly indoctrinated society where elementary truths are easily buried.
Okay, now it's worth taking that in detail. We live in entangled in webs of endless deceit. This is something that Chomsky had written, and Moyers picked up on it as the theme of his interview. We live in a highly indoctrinated society where elementary truths are easily buried. Well, he then gives you examples of what he means and lists them in an interesting order. He starts off with the particular and goes to the more general. Watch.
You have said that we live entangled in webs of endless deceit, that we live in a highly indoctrinated society where elementary truths are easily buried. You have said that we live entangled in webs of endless deceit, that we live in a highly indoctrinated society where elementary truths are easily buried. Elementary truths such as
the fact that we invaded South Vietnam, or the fact that we're standing in the way of significant, and have for years, of significant moves towards arms negotiation, or the fact that the military system is to a substantial extent, not totally, but to a substantial extent, a mechanism by which the general population is compelled to provide a subsidy to high technology industry. Since they're not going to do it if you ask them to, you have to deceive them into doing it. There are many truths like that, and we don't face them.
Many truths like that, and we don't face them. Now, he started off with the fact that we invaded Vietnam. He then pointed out that we stood in the way of arms negotiation, meaningful arms negotiations, and then points out an even bigger fact that in the whole military system, as he calls it, is a way of getting the population as a whole, taxpayers, to subsidize high-tech industries. Because, as he says, if you ask them, they're not going to do it. They have to be compelled to do it and deceived into doing that in the process. It's that process of deception in order to make the income transfer from the poor taxpayers to the richest industries, the high-tech industries. Now, he's saying this in 1988 when he's a faculty member at the school that does the most of this, namely MIT. And he affirms a belief in people's capacities to see what's going on. Take a look.
Do you believe in common sense? I mean, yours.
Absolutely.
You do.
I believe in Cartesian common sense. I think people have the capacities to see through the deceit in which they're ensnared, but they got to make the effort.
Now that's it. They have the capacities to see through the deceit in which they are ensnared, but they've got to make the effort. That's the key point. People have the capacities, but they've got to make the effort. Because it's not given to them in the media or anything else around them. It's something they have to spend some time working at in order to understand. Well, the elementary truths such as were enumerated by Chomsky at the time, but we ought to start enumerating our own elementary truths that are kept, in effect, in broad daylight, a matter of deception for us. It's not hard to come up with examples since 1988. His examples were based in the Vietnam War and then in arms negotiation. But there's been a deliberate attempt ever since by state powers to manipulate public understanding and own, in some sense, the narrative about what's going on in the world. You probably all remember the deliberate distortions of the shock and awe campaign of our president at the time of 2003, 15 years after Chomsky's observations in 1988. 15 years after was 2003. It's pretty staggering that this could still happen in some sense. And it's important to look at it because it was shocking and awful at the time, but something that we in effect ended up swallowing, and in fact the media did as well. It's really quite shocking. But take a look at what went on.
Repeat after me. I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly.
When George W. Bush took office in 2000, he brought with him some of the most conservative foreign policy voices in the Republican Party. Chief among them were Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and Deputy Secretary for Defense Paul Wolfowitz, all of whom had served together previously in the administrations of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Paul Wolfowitz, in particular, had long been recognized as the intellectual force behind a radical neoconservative fringe of the Republican Party. For years, Wolfowitz had been advancing the idea that the United States should reconsider its commitments to international treaties, international law, and multilateral organizations such as the United Nations.
So this is not just a Republican takeover, this is a very specific wing of the Republican Party. It's neoconservative, it's unilateralist, it doesn't believe in the rule of law, it doesn't believe you have to tell the public the truth.
And they happen to be an extremely arrogant, dangerous group of reactionary statists. They're not conservatives.
They have a political agenda with regards to foreign policy and that they had been working on for years and years, and writing about this and saying this is the post-Cold War vision. This is our post-Cold War vision for American power.
Ever since the Cold War ended, there were people who were fuming on the right, thinking, this is the golden opportunity now that Russia's out of the way for America to take over the world. We're not doing anything about it. Those damn liberals, those soft heads, are keeping us from doing what is our godly mission.
A radical plan for American military domination first surfaced during the administration of George H.W. Bush. In 1992, Paul Wolfowitz, working in the Department of Defense, was asked to write the first draft of a new national security strategy, a document entitled the Defense Planning Guidance. The most controversial elements of what would later come to be known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine were that the United States should dramatically increase defense spending, that it should be willing to take preemptive military action, and that it should be willing to use military force unilaterally.
Unilateral use of military force to establish and protect a new order.
With or without allies. This new reliance on military force was necessary, according to Wolfowitz, to prevent the emergence of any future or potential rivals to American power, and to secure access to vital resources.
Primarily Persian Gulf oil.
Especially Persian Gulf oil.
Okay, now this is written up in 1992. That's the first year that Clinton took over. Doesn't matter that Clinton took over. An office within the Pentagon is under Wolfowitz working on this new doctrine. It's really quite extraordinary. The blueprint for empire is written up while Clinton's in office by people who had been brought into the administration of Reagan and then George H.W. Bush, and then, in a sense, went underground to work on this in the Pentagon while Clinton became president. Wolfowitz worked from 1992 on and brought up this strategy for discussion within the Pentagon. It's really quite extraordinary. And from then on in, basically the conquest of the Middle East was on the agenda. Take a look.
I understand that they want the American public to believe that the invasion of Iraq was the response to September 11th. I think it is a lie. I believe that it is part of a neoconservative agenda to assert that American hegemony is untouchable. And September 11th gave them the opportunity to put in play plans that they had been considering since the first Bush administration.
In all of its previous incarnations, and long before 9/11 and the current war on terror, the Wolfowitz Doctrine had identified regime change in Iraq as a crucial first step toward global domination by force. In a widely circulated letter to President Bill Clinton in 1998, the members of the Project for the New American Century challenged the president to act forcefully and militarily to remove Saddam Hussein from power. 2 years later, George W. Bush would handpick many of these same neoconservatives for key foreign policy posts in the Pentagon and State Department. Once installed in government positions, as recent interviews with a number of former members of the Bush administration have revealed, the group maintained its long-standing focus on Iraq, a focus that intensified after the attacks of September 11th.
In the meetings of the inner sanctum of the Bush administration, the attack on Iraq was brought up from almost the first days, even though there was no evidence whatever that the Iraqis had been involved in this.
The president dragged me into a room with a couple of other people, shut the door, and said, I want you to find whether Iraq did this. That George Bush wanted me to come back with a report that said Iraq did this.
From the very beginning, there was a conviction that Saddam Hussein was a bad person and that he needed to go.
Just 5 hours after American Airlines Flight 77 struck the Pentagon, and without any evidence linking Saddam Hussein to the attacks of 9/11, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld was already ordering his aides to draw up plans for striking Iraq. The notes quote Rumsfeld as saying he wanted best info fast, judge whether good enough hit SH, meaning Saddam Hussein. Go massive, Rumsfeld continued in the notes. Sweep it all up, things related and not.
The problem for the Bush administration is that plans that already existed for regime change in Iraq had to be justified. They couldn't just go in without public support. The public support was created by connecting Saddam Hussein to those fears of terrorism. The fear generated by 9/11, the fear of terrorist networks, has to be transferred to Iraq. That is, the American people have to learn to be as afraid of Saddam Hussein as they are of Osama bin Laden.
Soon after September 11th, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld set up a small intelligence office in the Pentagon, the Office of Special Plans, to create the rationales for the already planned attack on Iraq, to convince people that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and that he was linked to Al-Qaeda and 9/11. Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski worked in the Pentagon's Near East and South Asia office. She witnessed how the Office of Special Plans issued talking points about Iraq for senior government officials, allegedly based on intelligence.
The information there drawn from fact, you could find bits and pieces of fact throughout, but framed, articulated, crafted to convince someone of what? Well, of things that weren't true. Things that weren't true. 911, Al-Qaeda related to Saddam Hussein, possibly some involvement there.
The liberation of Iraq is a crucial advance in the campaign against terror. We've removed an ally of Al-Qaeda.
The very things that a year later President Bush himself denies and feigns his surprise. I don't know why everybody thinks that.
We have no evidence that Saddam Hussein was involved with the September the 11th.
Well, I worked in a place where they concentrated on preparing this storyline and selling it to everyone that they could possibly sell it to.
It wasn't a failure of intelligence, it was the manipulation of intelligence to achieve a political goal.
Okay, selling the plan. It's unbelievable. And particularly unbelievable because the way in which the media not only bought it, they gobbled it up and spewed it forth to the American public on a scale that can't be mimicked in anything else but a straightforward propaganda machine. It's unbelievable. The collapse of the commercial press, which was under pressure of consolidation and getting licenses, and turns out that Colin Powell's son was in charge of giving permissions as a member of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. If they wanted favorable treatment by the FCC, the media began to treat things as the administration wanted to tell them. And they became, in effect, hook, line, and sinker operatives for the administration.
They were disciplined. They stayed on message. They marshaled all of their forces in this relentless public relations campaign to convince the American people that there was a threat from Iraq.
It's day 4 of the Bush-Cheney's full-court press, giving speech after speech after speech, and issuing reports.
The United States knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. Any country on the face of the earth with an active intelligence program knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
The choice is his. And if he does not disarm, the United States of America will lead a coalition and disarm him in the name of peace.
Okay, straightforward lies to the American public. There wasn't any evidence of weapons of mass destruction, and these became WMD, but they were weapons of mass deception aimed at the American people. In order to do what? Well, to vote additional funds for this kind of thing, to give sweetheart deals to military contractors, to launch the most unpopular, publicly unpopular publicly demonstrated against around the world invasion in March 2003. It's really quite an extraordinary history which has been buried ever since. But you ought to take a look at it, because the people involved in it were people that you'll see nowadays in various forms. Not only were they drawn upon from the George H.W. Bush days, but some of them persist to today, like John Bolton, for example, who eventually became the American ambassador to the UN, not because Congress approved him, but because he was made in a vacation appointment, as it were, a recession appointment which the president forced through when he couldn't get the approval of Congress. Well, in retrospect, 4 years after the sinking of the American press, people like Bill Moyers drew attention to it.
4 years ago this spring, the Bush administration took leave of reality and plunged our country into a war so poorly planned it soon turned into a disaster. The story of how high officials misled the country has been told, but they couldn't have done it on their own. They needed a compliant press to pass on their propaganda as news and cheer them on. Since then, thousands of people have died, and many are dying to this day. Yet the story of how the media bought what the White House was selling has not been told in depth on television. So as the war rages into its 5th year, we look back at those months leading up to the invasion, when our press largely surrendered its independence and skepticism to join with our government in marching to war.
Well, I'd urge you to look at it. It's called The Buying of the Iraq War. It's a very thorough report. And it details the fact that there were trillions of dollars being spent and piled up in the American national debt. And since then, the war has cost an estimated $5.6 trillion to the American taxpayer. And it's earned absolutely nothing, according to the author, Tom Engelhardt, here. In fact, that's not quite true, because it earned some people a great deal of money. The war profiteers, Halliburton among them, that old company of Dick Cheney. It was, in fact, very profitable for some. So the question remains that Moyers asked years before.
Good evening, I'm Bill Moyers. What's more dangerous, the big stick or the big lie? Governments have used both against their own people.
Governments have used both against their own people, and it's still being done. Take a look at this.
In recent years, a silent revolution has taken place. We thought the age of fossil fuels was coming to an end, and we hoped we were heading for a future filled with renewable energy. But in Texas, deep in the heart of the old oil industry, a handful of men have caused a dramatic shift, putting the United States firmly back on the map as an oil and gas producing superpower.
This breakthrough on shale turned out to be the biggest energy innovation so far of the 21st century.
Biggest energy innovation so far in the 21st century. Well, take a look at how it's received and perceived by people in Texas.
Produced in the United States, mainly in the states of Texas, California.
It looked as if the heyday of the US as an energy-producing superpower had come to an end. In the previous few decades, America had become known chiefly as the biggest consumer of fossil energy.
America is addicted to oil.
The country had become more and more dependent on foreign oil and gas. On several occasions, this led to costly and radical military intervention, the consequences of which are still to be seen.
If we hadn't proven the Barnett when we did, the price of natural gas would have gotten up to probably $20 an MCF and would have destroyed our economy.
The production of oil and gas in the US was dropping fast. George Mitchell was one of the many who needed to rescue their business. He had to find a new way of extracting gas and believed shale could be the way to go.
So what Mitchell started turned into a world-changing supply of energy. And in my opinion, it was a gift from God.
A gift from God. Well, it was a gift from the shale cowboys and their ideologues, people like Daniel Jurgen, who thought this was the biggest innovation in the 21st century. Fantastic. Well, in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act, George Orwell said at one point, and we're going to see what happens. Is this an oil revolution, or is it an extension of the oil bonanza, and therefore an increase in fossil fuel dependence? Not a moving away from them, but a new kind of dependence. That's what we'll look at next time when we look at entangled in webs of endless deceit, lying a state strategy of distraction. Thank you very much.